All right, welcome. This is going to be a tutorial for how to use VS Code with your Google Cloud VM. I'm going to walk through a few things here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the requirements that you need before starting this tutorial. Then we're going to talk about how to create another SSH key pair in order to get onto your Google VM from your local machine. We're then going to move on to how to download VS Code and all the extensions you'll need for this. Then we'll connect with the VM and then finally give a quick tour of where things are before I set you up for the next first steps of getting started with the mini Amazon standard version of the 3.16 project. Cool, so let's get started with that. And first up, just on the requirement side, what you'll need here are two things. You'll need your Google Cloud VM instance fully set up and synced, like we mentioned on the website for the course. So essentially what you want here is to be able to log into Google Cloud Platform and see that you have your VM instance ready to go. You've been able to connect with it to using SSH in the past. And all I've done here is I've set up a new VM instance called Project Setup Tutorial just for this. And I've done nothing else than the normal instructions that exist here on the course website. So all I did was set up a Google Cloud VM instance, and then I followed the instructions to ready that VM for the course. There are a whole bunch of other things that you could have done on the Google Cloud instructions, but I just did the basics. So I did all these prerequisites and creating the VMs. I did not set up an SSH key pair. I didn't set up GUI access. You won't need that for this tutorial, but those might still be good, and take a look at those. They'll definitely help you as you're understanding your VM and working with it. So that being said, you want your VM instance fully set up. If you don't have that, pause the video and then come back to this later. Make sure that you have that set up, and all those instructions, like I said, are on the course website already, so you can take a look there. The second thing you're going to need is you're going to need access to a terminal. So just a terminal on your local host is what I'm referring to here now. As long as you're able to see onto your local host, then you should be good. All right, so once you have all these requirements, you're ready to go, we'll get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an SSH key pair. And the reason we're doing this is to be able to connect your local machine, so your MacBook or Windows or whatever you have. In my case here, I'm using a MacBook. So to be able to connect that machine with your Google VM up in the cloud. You should already be able to access your Google VM through the browser by using this SSH button, connect, and it'll open a separate window where you use your VM. But here we're interested in working with it from local so that you can use some third-party tools like VS Code. Great, so setting up your SSH key, we're gonna be in the terminal to begin with here. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use the SSH keygen command. So you guys have used this before. You used it to generate some key for the VM itself, or to get access to GitLab. I know you must have interacted with this before. What you're going to do is you're going to specify a file name. That's what this -f does. And here we're going to specify tilde.ssh. And then we're going to name our key something. The reason I'm naming the key explicitly is that SSH will by default look in your file path here by tilde.ssh, and then it'll look for keys named something like ID RSA. And this is the default name, right? But if you want to use key names that are a little bit more descriptive, especially for a course something like this, where you might want to delete the key later and not also mess up a whole host of other things that you've set up using that key, it can be really helpful to have specific keys for specific things. So here I'm going to name this tutorial. Let's name it VS Code tutorial. All right. And just to make a note on this, You could also specify a whole other bunch of things here. So you could specify exactly what method. So this might be something you've seen before, -t, and then RSA. Now this is a little bit redundant because the default option is RSA, and that's just the encryption method you're using. You can also use totally different methods, something like ED25519. And these have different pros and cons, and you can go and read into that if you're super into it. But for this, I'm not going to specify anything, and that will then end up just using RSA for the encryption. Some other options you might have here to be aware of is -A. So this is the number of rounds that you'll do. Rounds, all you need to know about rounds for now is that the more rounds you have, the more robust you'll be against brute force attacks in the case that your private key gets leaked. So if you accidentally leak your private key, then a higher number of rounds will be more robust to brute force attacks to try to figure out what all of your passwords are. And you might want to set this to something like 100. Now, the detriment of this is that it'll be slower. But the benefit is that you have a stronger defense against brute force attacks. Now, again, I'm going to leave this off. So the default is 16. So it'll go 16 rounds. That's totally fine for what we're interested in here. And then I'm going to submit this. So one more thing maybe that I should know is tilde here could be replaced by users and then my MacBook username here, Rich. So this is something that you might see in the tutorial for this, the written tutorial. And this might make a little bit more sense. The reason we've written it out is that it more closely aligns between Windows and Mac, and so it's easier to go between the two. But either of these will work. They mean the same thing. So here I'll submit this, and this will create two files. It'll create one that's exactly named as what I'm named it here, usersrich.ssh VS Code tutorial. That will be your private key, and you should not share that with anyone. Then it'll also create a file that's called usersrich.ssh VS Code tutorial.pub public. This will be the public key that you can share with whatever machines you're trying to log into and whoever needs to be able to verify who you are. So I'll do that, and then it'll ask you for a passphrase here. I'm just going to hit enter twice because I don't want a passphrase for this key. That's totally fine. So now that we've generated these keys, we're going to want to go and edit our Google VM to add this public key so that it has access to it. Now, in order to do that, we need to know what that public key is. So first, we're going to say cat, and here we're going to go into SSH and just write what we called it, tutorial.pub. Right. So I want to grab the public key, and this will just print the public key straight in the terminal. If you don't want to print it straight into the terminal so people can see you, then you could pipe this to something like pbcopy, and that'll just copy it straight to your clipboard so you don't have to print it in the terminal. For the purpose of this, I'll just print it so that you guys can see what's going on. So here it prints the public key in its full total. So see, you can see that it used an RSA method. Here's the then key, and then it has some information about the user for that key. In this case, the user is Rich, which is my MacBook username. And the device that I'm using is MVP Rich, so that's the name of my device. So I'm going to grab this whole thing and hit Command C to copy that. And now I'm ready to go into the Google Cloud website here. Now I'm going to point myself to the VM instance that we're interested in. As I mentioned before, I set up this project setup tutorial VM instance just for this. And so I'll click the name of the instance to get up some of the information for this. Once that loads, I'm going to hit edit here at the top. And it just has a whole bunch of information about the VM. And I want to edit some of this information. Specifically, I'm going to scroll down all the way until I find SSH keys here. And you'll see that you might have 0 or more SSH keys. That's totally fine. I'm going to click show and edit here to enter my new public key that I just generated. So I'm going to copy that there. Now you'll notice on the left side, it gives me the username that I had for this key. And actually we want to edit this. So I'm going to edit this to become Ricard Sturborg, which is my Gmail username. It's really important that it's your Gmail username because that is what the, when you log in through the SSH button on this platform, that's the username that you're logging in with. So you want to set this to be the same username so that you're logging in to the same file path and that you have right access to all of the things that you've used previously on this VM. Otherwise, you end up in a different directory and you might have to deal with moving things back and forth or just start over for the project's sake in that folder. That's fine too, but try to do it this way so we don't have to deal with it in office hours later. Cool. So here I'm going to write Ricard Sturborg. This is my full Gmail username. And then once I'm ready for this, I'm going to hit save. Now this save takes quite a bit of time. It's not the fastest, but once that's done, we should be ready to go on the next step. And that step is downloading VS Code. So to download VS Code, just use the link that I've pasted here. This will be in the description of the video, and it's also on the tutorial itself, the written tutorial. So once you go on that website, you know how to download a program, you know how to install it. You've done this before. So for me, this would be Mac. Now I already have VS Code, so I won't do this. But you just download that, run it, put it in your app folder, and then once you're, maybe pause the video, and once you've done that, come back. Cool, you're back. You got VS Code up and running, and it'll look something like this when you first open a window. So this is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code, as we've written in the description, is an IDE. It helps you develop and write programs, has a whole host of features and extensions that will help you become more efficient as you write, and not be in a total headache about the fact that you can't move your cursor in the terminal, right? Now, for those of you that are very advanced, you can try to master Vim and brag about how you're very good at using Vim, even though it's slower than using Visual Studio Code. So you got Visual Studio Code up, great. What we're gonna do is we're gonna install an extension that we need here. This extension is called Remote SSH. It's a pretty basic extension, and it'll just allow you to use VS Code to connect through SSH and actually alter files that aren't locally on the machine. So here you can see the first two are actually the ones that we're interested in. Both of them are by Microsoft, and they have about 4.5 million downloads. So I already have it installed. Here, you're going to install it, click install, and make sure that you also get the Remote SSH editing configurations file. This is an important extension that you'll need in order to be able to edit some config files later on. So as long as you got both of these, then you are fully ready to go on to the next step, which is connecting with the VM, right? So here, I'm going to close this left pane by hitting Command B. Command B will open and close this pane. And then I'm going to hit Command Shift P, or you can use F1, function 1, and that will open a command. It'll open this quick menu at the top. Sometimes you'll see it like this. You can just add the caret there yourself in order to type some command. And I'm going to type remote SSH connect to host. And here I have a list of hosts already because I've used this before. So they're already fully set up. Now for you, probably what will only show up is add a new SSH host and configure SSH hosts. What you're going to want to hit is add new SSH host, and that'll open another window at the top that will allow you to put your SSH command in that you want to use to connect to your Google Cloud VM. Importantly here, I'm going to write SSH and then the Gmail username that I noted from before, which is Ricard Sturborg for me. Then I'm going to And here I need to grab the external IP address of my VM instance. So I'm going to go back to Google Cloud. I'm going to go to my VM instances, wait for it to load. And then I'm going to scroll across to the right here for the external IP column. And I'm going to copy this IP address. This is the IP address that points to your VM externally. And once you have that, you can set that as the domain for your SSH connection. I'm going to specify one more thing since we named the key that we created. Since we named the key we created, I have to note where that identity file actually exists. And if you remember, we created that in tilde.ssh and we called it VS Code tutorial. Now, you obviously might have called it something totally different, VM for 316 or whatever you wanted to call it. That's fine. But I'm going to point to this one. And once I have this, I hit enter to connect. It'll ask me where I want to place the information for this host, and I'm going to place it in the same directory as the key itself exists. So this will be users.rich.ssh config for me. This config file just contains a bit of information about each host, and we'll see more on that later. So now that we've added that new host, we can hit Command-Shift-P again, or F1, to bring up the command bar again. And now we're actually going to connect to it. So here we're going to do connect. And we'll see this new IP address here at the bottom. That's the machine that we just added. So we can connect to this one here. And it'll take a bit of time. Are you sure you want to connect? Yes, I'm sure. It might ask you what type of machine it is. In this case, say Linux. And then once it's brought up, you'll see here at the bottom left corner, a green bar that just indicates that you're editing on this machine rather than your local machine. And that's great. So actually, I'm going to close this connection to make one more change, and then I'm going to connect to the machine again. But right now, we're connected to my instance of the VM on Google Cloud. So I'm going to close this remote connection. And all I did there was hit the bottom left green tab, and then I closed the connection. And now I'm going to bring up the command palette again. I'm going to say Command-Shift-P. I'm going to say remote SSH connect to host. So I'm just hitting enter on this command again. Now, however, I want to edit some things about the SSH host config file. So I'm going to say configure SSH hosts, and then I'm going to pick the file that I picked in that first instance, which was users rich SSH config. So that'll bring up my config file. And here at the very bottom, we'll see the host that we just added. Now I have a whole bunch of other hosts as well. You guys may or may not have that, depending on what you've connected with through SSH and what keys you have. But here we have a little bit of information. So in the top bar, you have a shorthand for the host itself. So this is the nickname of the host. Below that, you have the host name. The host name, don't change this one because that has to be the IP address in order to connect in the right place. Below that, you have the username that you use to connect to that machine. And below that, the location of the identity file as we provided it. So if you remember, this is the path that we provided after the flag -i. Right. Now, the change I want to make is I want to change the nickname here to be something a little bit more informative so that I know what that machine is. And the reason for that is if you have a whole bunch of hosts that are all different IP addresses, it becomes very hard to keep track of which one's which unless you think purely in numbers. So here I'm going to call it VS Code tutorial VM. I'm going to save this file, and then I'm going to close that. Now I can connect again one more time to my host, and we'll see in the lists of hosts that I have that it's now called VS Code tutorial VM. So that's great. I connect to this one. and all of a sudden I get my window, I'm on the machine, I'm ready to go. I have VS Code set up to work on this machine. And this is just like connecting to it from the browser, except you can do a lot more with this tool. So I'm going to make this full screen now. But obviously, you might right off the top say, well, what the heck? I can't do anything. I don't know how to use this tool. So a couple of commands that you're going to want to do is well, first of all, you might want to open some folder, right? So here we open just the main directory, home, record storyboard. This will be the place where all my files are. So if I open this, now you'll notice that when you hit here, just say, yes, you trust the authors. Here in the top left, you'll see the Explorer. You can open this window and you'll see all the files that exist on your VM in the folder that you open. So if you want to access things that are a directory up, then you have to open a folder that's one directory up. I have a whole bunch of things here. You have the VS Code server, which is what we just set up on this machine. I have some Anaconda information, which is just packages and installation things. And you can also see that I have the init script, which is what we run to initialize the VMs for this course. And then I have some SSH keys that help connect me whenever I am using SSH. Okay, so great. You can access these files and you can edit them directly here, just like any other IDE. But what about a terminal? So if you hit Control tilde or Control, I think it's called grave accent. What I'm talking about are these symbols, that one and that one. So if you hit that button and Control, you'll bring up the terminal or you'll remove the terminal. Once you open the terminal here, you can issue whatever commands you want, just like a normal terminal, and interact with your machine as if you were SSH'd in, but it's all right here, all ready to go. Some more things that you can do, and sort of the power of having an IDE while you're working, is you can use debugging tools, right? So you can run and debug different programs, and you might have to install further extensions to help you with this. But in this left pane here, under the bug and the play symbol, you can run and debug things. So for example, you can add a bunch of stop points to your program, run them up to that point, and then see the states of all the variables, so that you don't have to write a bunch of print statements and then run the code over and over and over. That gets very tiring very fast. So learn to use a debugger and you'll save a ton of time in your classes, courses, your work, everything. Once you have this, we'll do one more thing. Let's set up the first step of the project, the standard version of the project. So if you're planning on doing the standard version, the mini Amazon, then go to the link in the description or in the tutorial, and you'll arrive at a repo for the skeleton. So this is a basic implementation with a few functionalities to help you out to get started. It has a bit of a front end and just shows you how to use Flask in general to get you started. So here at the very top, what you're going to want to do when you get here is you're going to want to immediately fork this repo. Don't clone it as it is, because we're not going to accept your merge requests. We're only fork it and then make changes on your own fork. So here you create some fork, you name it whatever you want. Maybe your team wants to make it mini Alibaba instead of Amazon, and you write some project description here. Once you're done with that, you make this public, or you can make it private, but then you have to make sure to add all the TAs and the professors as intended. And this gets a bit messy. So unless you're working on something that's like the open project and you want to keep it secret for a while, or you don't want to share your code publicly, then just make it public. This makes it a lot easier for all of us. And there's a lot of bad code out there, so don't be embarrassed to have your bad code online, because we all do. You fork this project, and once you fork it, you'll basically end up with your own repo of your own. Once you have that, now you're ready to clone it. So you go into cloning button here, copy the clone with SSH text, and go back to your VS Code terminal. You want to be in whatever directory that you're interested in having this repo in, and then you're going to do git clone, and then the string that you just copied from the GitLab website. So this will clone the repo into your directory. And actually, if you go into your file explorer now, you'll be able to see that it got cloned in there with all the files that you need, and everything. There's a few more steps to getting the skeleton up and running. Some of that has to do with setting up a firewall rule, which you might have already done if you have the Google Cloud VM and you followed all of those tutorial instructions. But if you haven't, don't worry, it's really simple. Other than that, you're also just going to want to run this initializing script, which is called init Amazon. And there's a couple other things, but that is all in the description of the repo itself. So if you go into the README of the repo, it explains exactly how to deploy the current skeleton and how to hide passwords. Those are the two things that you're going to want to do at the very beginning of the project. And then after that, you're just developing your own project. If you have any questions about this whole process, I know I went super fast. That's just to preserve the time, and you can pause and go back if things were confusing. But if you have questions still, or something's not working for you, then feel free to come into TA office hours, and we'll make sure to help you get set up with the project. One more thing that I'll note is when you were on the VM instances, you walked into the VM instance that you were interested in getting access to, and then you edited the keys here. You're going to need to add a key for every person that needs access to that VM. So if you're working on the same VM, then you're going to need to add the public keys of whoever needs access to that VM. If you're working on separate VMs, then you do all of this separately. That's totally fine. Great. That is everything. If you have questions, come into office TA hours or post on Ed. Thank you so much.